don't know me, I'm Matt Walters. I'm the executive director here at St. Leonard. Thanks for being with us today. I have been asked to step in and introduce this speaker, and of course happy to always do so. Quick couple notes to mention is that today's presentation is being filmed by yours truly, Bob Daly, for the Miami Valley Communications Council, and it will be played on their channels. It will also be available to you all on the St. Leonard channel, so feel free to look back and take a look at that. Today's program is Russia's invasion of Ukraine and what to expect in year 2 of the conflict. Dr. Doerr is a professor of international studies at Cedarville University. He's a citizen of 3 countries, was born in the United Kingdom, moved to Canada as a teenager, and then to the United States to obtain his PhD. His teaching and research interests include nationalism, secession, political violence, that of nuclear weapons and terrorism, and Christianity and politics. Quite the array, my friend. He is the editor of Secessionism and Terrorism and author of Secessionism in the European Union. He has also authored the book Patriotism and the Cross, which was published in 2020. He serves as policy fellow for the Wallace Institute of Arctic Security, which advocates for robust U.S. policy for the Arctic. In addition to his academic duties, he is an elected official and currently serves as city council member in Beaver Creek, Ohio.
Well, thank you so much for the very warm welcome, for the introduction, Mark, and for the invitation, Kelly. Very much appreciated, and thank you all for being here today. What a wonderful turnout. Greetings from my department chair, Dr. Mark Caleb Smith. He told me you have to go to St. Leonard, you have to go see the people there because they are really interested in the affairs of the country and world affairs generally. And so thank you so much for being in attendance. I have a wonderful privilege today before I get going of actually having my parents here. Ordinarily, I don't have the opportunity to be with them too much. They live in Canada, and just the opportunity to see me speak is rare. So I have my parents, Mike and Jane Doerr, that are here. So I'm so thankful because they sacrificed so much for my sister and I just to pursue our dreams and goals. And so it's wonderful to spend time with them. I want to send regrets on behalf of my wife, Rebecca. She would have been here today. She really wanted to be with all of you, but in Beaver Creek, it's the end of the 3rd quarter of the school system, and it's early dismissal, so they're getting off the bus in about 15 minutes. And so our 3 children, Declan, and then our twins, Harper and Camille, are there. So she's picking them up off the bus. So what's happened in this conflict? Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And we have recently marked the 1-year anniversary of just a brutal invasion of one country that sits on the UN Security Council of another country, both of which used to be part of the Soviet Union. And that occurred on February the 24th, 2022. And it happened in the aftermath of really a very significant military buildup. Russia, like any country, has the right to defend its borders, to engage in military exercises. And what they do is on a quadrennial basis, so that is a rotation every 4 years, they move around the country to prepare for military threats that happen. I know in a room like this, there are many military veterans of the United States. May I first say thank you to all of you for your service and for what you've done for our country. My generation, other generations may not say it as much as we should, but thank you all for your investments and the things that you've done to build the society in which we live and the things that we enjoy, and forgive us for taking those for granted for some time. But thank you all for the ways you've built it. With Russia, what they do, like I said, is they go on a quadrennial rotation, and one is called Vostok, which in Russian means the east, and so they'll train for military threats in the east. Then they'll move the next year to Center, or the center of the country, again to prepare for military threats, particularly in the Arctic. Then to Kavkaz, which is the Caucasus Mountains in their southwest. So think Turkey, Iran, the Caucasus countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. And then they go to the Zapad, which is to the west. And that's what happened in late 2021. And again, this is completely normal in terms of our rotation. But they had close to 200,000 troops on the western border with Ukraine training in September of 2021. The military exercises ended, and those troops stayed. And they stayed. Thanksgiving in the United States came and went. The New Year came and went. These same troops then engaged in military exercises with the neighboring country of Belarus, practicing, building up, all of it kind of overshadowing what ended up being a brutal invasion beginning on February the 24th. This was also a resumption of aggression that started in 2014, and in many non-military ways started much earlier in terms of cyber conflict, and then also interfering in elections in Ukraine as well. And so in 2014, in the aftermath of the Sochi Winter Olympic Games held in Russia, we have an invasion of Crimea, an illegal annexation of that territory, and then non-insigniary military individuals going into the states or the oblasts of Donetsk and Luhansk in Ukraine, and effectively annexing those territories as well, although not in a formal or legal sense. And so in 2014, Crimea annexed, and then Donetsk and Luhansk in the east as well. And so we have seen now a continuation of this conflict from 2014, and over a year of warfare, leading to some very, very brutal and bloody outcomes. Casualties vary depending on the source. Some sources suggest upwards of 300,000 Russian soldiers have been killed. That's probably high, but that's the one estimate that's out there. And then there are many others in terms of Ukrainian military and civilian casualties. It's worth noting that this conflict has been heavily internationalized as well. There's a Ukrainian Foreign Legion, and so people from across the world have lost their lives in this conflict as well. So if we go back to March of 2022, this was the rough situation. We have the aforementioned Donetsk and Luhansk. Like I said, they're kind of like states of Ukraine. There are 24 oblasts, 24 states within their country, Crimea being one as well. And as I noted, the Russians were working with the Belarusians. Belarus is the country to the north, also part of the old Soviet Union. And this is where the military exercises in early 2022 led to then an invasion of the north, wherein Russian forces tried to capture the capital city of Kyiv and the second largest city of Kharkiv in the east in very quick succession. Some analysts suggested that it would be a 72-hour blitz and Russia would take Ukraine. Simultaneously, we also saw an attack from these bases in Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk to try and take other territory of Ukraine in the east and then meet up in Kharkiv and Kyiv and then presumably sweep across all of Ukraine. And so we can see the early days of the war. In red, you can see areas captured by Russian troops, and where it's kind of checkered a little bit, or that's also where there were advances at that time. And so that's roughly a year ago from today. In tandem with that, there was a significant Russian missile attacks, and there have been about a dozen major attacks across the country. And as you can see, it's not simply limited to Kyiv, Kharkiv, or to the east. We've also seen these bombing campaigns across the country hitting mid-size and smaller cities as well. So while the fighting has not been really seen in much of central or western Ukraine, they have, by the way, experienced significant missile attacks as well. But if we look at a map of today, where is it today? We can see that the Ukrainians have been overwhelmingly successful in pushing back against the Russians and very valiantly defending their territory. You can see both Kyiv and Kharkiv are in Ukrainian hands. But nonetheless, despite these victories in the north and northeast of the country, Russian forces have gained ground. So let me help you with the map a little bit. The yellow area is anything that's in color is Ukrainian territory under international law. In the purple, these are areas that were either annexed by Russia or effectively occupied by Russia in 2014. And the areas in red are places that Russian forces have taken, again illegally under international law, and currently occupy. Having said that, there are areas in Kherson, Mykolaiv, Zaporizhia, out in the outskirts of Kharkiv that the Ukrainians have more recently won back. But there is something of a solidification of this ground between the two combatants at this time. I do not call it a stalemate because for many in Ukraine, what they're trying to do is wear down Russian forces and then push back and win back their territory in the probably short to medium term. Russia has also called up an estimated 300,000 conscripts, typically from areas of Russia where there are a lot of non-ethnic Russian minorities. Typically, these are areas of Russia that are much less likely to rebel against the central government as well. And so there are a lot of poorer people from ethnic minorities that are dying for the cause of Russia in Ukraine. But this map gives us a good sense of its situation. War_mapper is a Twitter handle, and so you can actually follow pretty reasonably how the war is going, and it's updated daily as well. So why is this important? It's a really big deal because even though on the evening news you will see an array of problems, there are political problems, political issues, many issues within our country and many issues within the world. And yet what you will not ordinarily see on the nightly news is that there's been some pretty good news since the end of World War II. That is, the likelihood of interstate war or wars between countries has markedly declined. It really is quite amazing. Now, you're thinking there's still a lot of war out there, and you're absolutely right. There are a lot of civil wars, but the traditional war of one army invading another and then the potential for escalation has markedly declined. And it really is an amazing thing. There are a lot of reasons for it, but it's something worth celebrating. Warfare between countries is far rarer than it was. Moreover, under the international system that was created with the United Nations and buttressed by the US military, NATO, etc., is that annexing territory is a faux pas. It's something you shouldn't do post-1945. Out of the reasoning of, Hitler did it, invaded numerous countries, and if we were to send forces to defeat Hitler, we've got to stop doing these types of things. We've got to respect different countries that have sovereignty. And so the idea of simply taking things from others is a faux pas. And yet we live in a world where might still makes right. There's crime, there are issues. The UN isn't going to fly in and stop every single conflict. And so there's still the real potential for conflict. It's also a big deal because where does this stop? For Vladimir Putin, he wrote an essay, 7,000 words, in the summer of 2021. It's easy to download, easy to read. I shouldn't say easy to read, but there's a lot of history behind it. But the real danger is if he wins in Ukraine, the same logic in the essay fits any other area with large numbers of ethnic Russians. So it could be Ukraine, obviously. Ukraine, in fairness, does in its east and south have a significant ethnic and linguistic Russian minority. By the way, the vast majority of these folks have sided with Ukraine and have fought for Ukraine in this. It should be worth noting. Belarus, the country to the north, there's been a leaked document recently that says that Putin effectively seeks to unify the two by 2030. That recently came out. Moldova is a little country between Ukraine and Romania. It's actually just to this side in here. So you have Romania, which is a NATO country, Hungary, Slovakia, Poland, all NATO countries, Moldova in here that used to be part of the Soviet Union as well. But effectively, it's long been believed that they would be next after Ukraine. We have the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, that are members of NATO as well, and the European Union. They used to be part of the Soviet Union. Finland from 1809 through 1917 was part of the Russian Empire. And so the same logic holds that if it was once part of Russia, it should be back in that fold. That too becomes a big issue. And then if we take the satellite states of Eastern Europe during the Cold War, Poland, East Germany, especially parts of Poland that used to be part of the Russian Empire prior to the creation of the Soviet Union. And then the countries of Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, they too could face the same fate, notably those in Kazakhstan in the very north of the country, a lot of ethnic Russians there. So it's hugely important because if it doesn't stop in Ukraine, it could well escalate, it could well go into all of these other areas, given enough time and resources. So it's a big deal. If we look at conflicts in the world, the number of wars between countries has dramatically declined, but this is a graph from the end of World War II in 1945 through the present, showing the number of conflicts in the world. And as you can see, there are still a lot of civil wars. So wars between countries have become rare, but wars within countries remain. And once a conflict is internationalized, it typically lasts 3 times longer than historically. So what can you expect in year 2 of this conflict, Russia's invasion of Ukraine? Unfortunately, the bad news is it will probably continue to last for a good while. Hard to say when it will stop, but you can see as well conflicts within countries elsewhere in the world. The other piece of good news is that war deaths have actually markedly declined. And this is very, very good news. Again, not what you hear on the evening news, but in terms of conflicts, because they're not between countries generally, we have seen a dramatic decline in the number of military deaths. Now, this is a military death, not civilian deaths, not drug cartels, not opioid, not cancer, not heart disease, things of that nature that are still very, very significant in our world. One of the dangers, though, of Russia's brutal aggression against Ukraine is it could lead to a world where this spikes again, where it becomes normal, where other dictators around the world, from China to Iran to Turkey, could look at some neighboring territories, and they all have neighboring territories which they covet. They could engage in military aggression if this comes to pass and Russia is successful and the rest of the world turns away. So what's at stake here? A big question that I'm often asked is Putin trying to rebuild the Soviet Union? The answer to that is probably not. Putin is heavily anti-communist. The Soviet Union was communist, as many of you know, as many of you were active in the Cold War. But there's a very real likelihood that he's trying to rebuild the Russian Empire. That is a heavily ethnically Russian-based empire that was in place until 1917 under the Tsars. The last Tsar being Nicholas II in the Romanov line that lasted from 1613 to 1917. And so that is probably part of the calculation, that Russia is trying to expand its borders to some of its historical extents. There are very real dangers of escalation. I think there are many people that still fear that this will turn into some form of NATO-Russia conflict, NATO-Russia-China, World War III. It's not impossible. There are real dangers of that type of escalation, especially if Russia hits a target in NATO territory. And as I noted, Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Romania all sit in very close proximity or on the border with Russia. Ukraine, in many ways, is a buttress for democracy and constitutional rights. And while not perfect and while rife with corruption and all kinds of issues, Ukraine has made very significant progress over the last 30 years. And it is worth saying that it was inherited from the Soviet Union, a bastion of a very, very closed system, a very brutal system. Ukraine has worked very hard to try and make improvements. And so they stand at the forefront of protecting democratic and constitutional rights. The world is also increasingly being pushed into two spheres. China and Russia on one hand, the United States, NATO countries, those democracies in East Asia and Oceania as well. It's not to say that we're falling into a war or it's the exact circumstances that preceded World War I. As an example, China and the United States remain in a very strong bilateral trade situation. There's some $650 billion of trade between the two countries each year. But having said that, there are dangers of the Chinese Communist Party, its position, and its growing strength. I should also note that many countries in the world are non-aligned. Many have not taken positions. Many have not put in place sanctions against Russia for its brutal aggression. And then we have to think, too, in the United States about taxpayer monies. Just what's given to Ukraine, how much, and the dangers of escalation. These all take place in a point of discussion over what's at stake and what's going to happen in this next year. So for this next segment, I'd like to talk about some of the history and some of the background as to why this happened. None of this is to excuse Vladimir Putin for the aggression that is, again, illegal and has changed our world, but it is worth trying to get inside his mind a little bit to try and assess, what is he thinking? Why did he launch this brutal war in the first place? What he calls a special military operation. And so this is going to seem like a strange point to start. It's from a book of the Bible called Colossians, where the Apostle Paul is writing to a church in modern-day Greece called Colossae. And there's a lot in this for Christians, but what I want to do instead here is to hover on a term, Scythians. And the Scythians were a people group that lived north of the Black Sea 2,000 years ago. These are the people that lived in what is Ukraine today. So it's kind of fascinating that it's in the Bible, written by the Apostle Paul, that you've got a listing of people. Some context is also useful. So the barbarians were typically Germanic peoples that were outside of the Roman Empire. To the north, it was not conquered by the Roman Empire, and it's part of the terminology that they're fierce fighters because even the mighty Romans were unable to occupy this territory. Sometimes the Scythians are described as ultra-barbarians because they too, despite being fairly close to Rome, were not ever under the occupation of the Roman Empire as well. The other point that's worth noting here is that the English translation is a bit unfortunate because our connotation of barbarian is someone that's uncultured or uncouth or in some ways outside of civilization, and that's not true. They just wanted to fiercely protect their own sovereignty. And so both the Germanic and Scythian peoples really wanted to protect their sovereignty. And it's interesting today, 2,000 years later, the fierce fighting that the people in the same region are doing to preserve their land against an outside invader. If we look at a modern map, what's worth noting here is that Russia is by far the world's largest landmass still. Even though the Soviet Union dissolved on Christmas Day of 1991, and we think of the Soviet Union breaking apart into 15 different countries that you can see kind of in the colors on the map, Russia is by far still the world's largest country by landmass. Canada number 2, the United States number 3, China very close number 4. There are 11 time zones in Russia. Imagine doing business from Moscow or St. Petersburg to Vladivostok. Think about its foreign relations. In the United States, we have Canada, Mexico. There are some complications as well, but look at all the countries that border Russia. Norway technically has a border. Finland, 810 miles. Estonia, Latvia, both Lithuania and Poland are next to Kaliningrad here, which is a Russian oblast that sits between the two. Belarus, Ukraine, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, China, Mongolia, and an 8-mile border with North Korea, Japan, across the Bering Strait, the United States, the state of Alaska. So it's still a massive country. In 1991, roughly 150 million people. So less than half the size of the United States today. We're at about 335 million Americans today. That population, though, has declined by about 10 million. It's a little above 140 million today. Life expectancy for men has improved a little bit, but for a long time, it was 62 years of age. So major health issues internally, drug abuse, all kinds of challenges that have led to shorter lifespans, particularly for men in Russia. Very, very low birth rates as well. Typically 1.2, 1.3 children per woman in Russia. And so the country is beginning to shrink to some degree. It's worth noting that 75% of all Russians live in this corridor alone. So this is very, very sparsely populated. I'll simply put it that way. There are a lot of ethnic minorities in Russia where the birth rates are much higher. And there's a history of rebellion and potentially a desire to break away and create their own countries. Many of you will remember the Chechen wars of the 1990s, for example. That is one kind of case in point. Chechnya being an ethnic republic, one of the 83 states of Russia in this area. Sorry, it's a little further down here. So what is he thinking? What is he doing? Is he trying to rebuild the Russian Empire? Is he worried about Russia's demographic decline? Is he arrogant? Is he trying to be the next Peter the Great? Peter the Great, by the way, launched the Great Northern War in the year 1700, and as a result, St. Petersburg, the second largest city of Russia, was built in that aftermath and as part of that conflict and as part of that expansion of Russia. There's some documentation that suggests that he is trying to be the next Peter the Great and in his mind rescue Russia from its problems. This is the Russian coat of arms on top of the Russian flag. And it's worth noting that in the Russian history books, Russian universities, this symbol of the double-headed eagle is still very powerful. One that looks to the future, but one that looks to a long, long past and remembers very, very long periods of history. In the United States, one of the beautiful parts of our society is that we look forward a lot. We try and make things better, improve them for our kids and our grandkids, always seeking to improve. But sometimes we forget to look backwards a little bit. And it's worth noting that Russians do this a lot. What seems to many people to be dead and in the past and history, in Russia might not be that way, might not be taught as such, might just be viewed as a temporary blip that will be replaced or redone at some point as well. So it's worth noting that. I also want to talk about the founding of Russia. Russia was founded as Kievan Rus in the 800s. Not the 1800s, the 800s. We're going some 1,200 years ago. And if you're thinking in the name, Kiev, I've heard that, that's the capital city of modern-day Ukraine. And so in part, in the psyche, Russia's founding is interconnected with Kiev as a part of the territory. And on this map, you can see Kievan Rus as it expanded from the dark blue to the lighter blue into the orange and became a pretty significant country in and of itself during its time period. Now, to use the modern notion of country is a bit of a misnomer. It didn't exactly look like what it does today, but nevertheless, there was a boundary, a population, a form of government, commerce, all of these things that took place. This, however, was interrupted in 1237 when the Mongol Empire invaded. If you think of the Mongols, Genghis Khan or Chinggis Khan invading from east to west, capturing vast swaths of what is now Asia into Europe, Russia, or Kievan Rus, was occupied from 1237 to 1480. They were occupied for 243 years. Think about that in the psyche of a country. Parents and grandparents and the next generation and the next generation and the next generation and the next generation only knew the Mongols as the overlords. By comparison, we in the United States declared our independence in 1776. It is now the year 2023. That's 247 years. In 1480, though, the Mongols were defeated, and the new Russian state began as the Grand Duchy of Muscovy, or Moscow, kind of a centralized location. And by 1533, in the very dark green here, we have this newly constituted entity, and it begins to expand and expand. And as you can see, by the time we include all of the light green and we're into the 1600s, it's more prominent. What you should also see on this map is that Ukraine is not part of that Russia. The Ukrainians and Ukraine, it's outside of it, or at least most of it. And so indeed, parts of Ukraine are captured by 1654, but it is also to say that it has a mutually unintelligible language, Ukrainian versus Russian, that there is a separate culture, that there's a separate backdrop, and that this nationalism of Ukrainians was led mainly by farmers, people working the earth that pushed back against what governing officials told them in Russian. It is the seat of a Ukrainian identity. However, to give further backdrop and to be fair to Mr. Putin, again, this is by no means to excuse his blatant aggression that's illegal. Russia has been invaded from the West on 5 occasions, and this is an ongoing fear in the Russian psyche. In 1610, again, I just mentioned the Romanov line. There have only ever been 2 monarchical lines in Russia's history, the Ruriks going back to 800s, and the Romanovs from 1613 onward. The link between the 2 families is Anastasia Romanov, who was the first wife of Ivan the Terrible. And her grandnephew, Michael, ended up being the boyar or the noble that was able to become the Tsar in order to move the line forward after the Ruriks had died off. And Ivan the Terrible was a big reason for that. But there are 5 different invasions from the West, and so in Russia's mind, they have long been fearful of being surrounded or intimidated by the West. We have the Commonwealth of Poland-Lithuania that invaded Russia and occupied Moscow for almost 3 years. It led to a period known as the Time of the Troubles, and that is where the Rurik line died and the Romanov line then took over. But in the Russian mind, the Poles and Lithuanians, a powerful commonwealth in their time, they have taken our territory and we need revenge. I mentioned the Great Northern War launched by Peter the Great in the year 1700. The Kingdom of Sweden pushed back heavily and invaded parts of Russia in 1709. And so that too is in the Russian psyche of that action. We then have Napoleon's invasion. This is the 6th coalition in the Napoleonic Wars in 1812. To provide a little context here, we have the French Revolution, we have conflicts surrounding that, but then we have 7 different coalitions that are launched against Napoleon to try and stop his aggression of building a French empire across Europe. The 6th coalition was the French trying to launch an invasion all the way to Russia, and they did indeed get to the outskirts of Moscow, siege the area, but indeed, one of the follies of all of this is that Napoleon launched it into winter, and of the 700 or so thousand French and conscript troops, only about 50,000 returned, and it was a turning of the tide in the Napoleonic Wars. It took the 7th coalition, the Battle of Waterloo, a very famous one, that ultimately ended Napoleon's desires for a greater France. In the Russian Civil War of 1917, so right now we're in the Great War, or what today we call the First World War. We have Russia alongside France and the United Kingdom in the Triple Entente, pushing back against Germany, the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires. But in the midst of that, Russia had significant economic and morale issues, wherein we then saw the Bolshevik Revolution bringing the communists to power at that time. It should be noted that that was the 3rd in a series of 3 revolutions that very much weakened Russia and launched it into a civil war that didn't end until 1922. This drew troops from all over Europe, from different areas, including 13,000 American troops that were stationed and fought in the Russian Civil War. And then in the midst of World War II, we have Hitler's Germany invading from the west as well. So in the Russian mindset, remember the double-headed eagle looking forward and backwards. In Russia's mind, they've been invaded 5 times from the west. What do we do, is their thought. As revenge, I mentioned Poland. We have the Commonwealth of Poland, Lithuania, invading, occupying Moscow for almost 3 years. Poland was partitioned on 3 occasions, 1772, 1793, and 1795, where the Prussians, the Austrians, and the Russians worked together to get rid of Poland, slowly whittling it down. But I want you to see this because between 150 and 200 years later, they got revenge. That long history of looking back and getting revenge for things. If we fast forward to the Russian Civil War, the Russian Empire, as I noted, had Finland. Finland became part of the Russian Empire in the Napoleonic Wars in 1809. We have the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland. But when the Russian Civil War broke out in 1917, these territories wanted their independence back and badly and gained it. Ukraine did too. Ukrainians fought mightily to get rid of the Bolsheviks. Eventually they lost, and Ukraine was incorporated forcefully into the Soviet Union in 1922. And then we have the Soviet Union thereafter. Speaking of revenge, in 1939 we have the invasion of Poland by the Nazis. In the West, that's usually what we're taught, but it's worth noting that the Soviets also invaded Poland, and this territory was effectively split. We don't tend to denigrate the Soviets because they ended up being on the Allied side in that, but that's only after Hitler reneged upon his agreement with Stalin and then invaded the Soviet Union into the south, into Ukraine. What I want to focus on here, though, is a lesser-known conflict known as the Winter War. And that is, during World War II, the Soviet Union attempted to invade Finland. The Soviet Union was in excess of 200 million people at the time. Finland, 3 million. And yet, despite the overwhelming odds, the rest of the world, its attention focused rightly on World War II, the Finns defended their territory. Basically didn't lose and only gave some minor territorial concessions that you see in here simply to get rid of the Soviet Union. But it's also to say that Russian forces, when they move forward, tend to blunder, tend to do it very unprofessionally, and do tend to lose. Russian forces do tend to be very good at defending their own territory, but they do tend to be bad offensively. But again, to reiterate the point, revenge, trying to capture what was once within Russia as well. Sweden used to occupy Finland historically, was the other part of that. And so if we look at the Soviet Union in 1945, post-World War II, World War II was a conflict that claimed the lives of an estimated 75 to 80 million soldiers. I mean, just shocking numbers overall. But the biggest losses actually came from Soviet forces. The Soviet Union lost an estimated 25 million soldiers. I mean, just shocking again. And so at the end of this conflict, Stalin made the case that Russia really needs a buffer zone from the West. It needs some level of special provision because these Westerners keep invading. And especially along the northern plains that are typically pretty flat, it's cost a lot of Russian lives. And so in red you see the extent of the Soviet Union, and you also see some of the modern countries today Georgia's listed, Moldova, Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. Kaliningrad, again, is an oblast, a state within Russia, Crimea within Ukraine. And so Russia ends up effectively getting a buffer zone in what the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill calls the Iron Curtain. In a very famous speech, Prime Minister Churchill described from Stettin, a city in the Baltic, so up here, to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across Europe that is dividing the largely democratic and capitalist West from the communist East, but in so doing, locking in countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, that was built out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Yugoslavia, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, and East Germany, without their consent, but also creating this larger buffer zone. And so in the West, we might look at it and say, well, this is the Soviet Union, but in the Soviet mind, they might have looked at it and said, this is all ours. This is all allied with us in one way, shape, or form. And so when the Cold War ends, again to go back to December of 1991, I'll go here, we have a second, maybe third, time of the Troubles. We have a Soviet Union that attempts to reform, if you remember the terms of perestroika and glasnost. We have Gorbachev very boldly trying to reform his society, but we also see it splinter. And the Soviet Union end, and 15 different countries emerge, and then a real time of economic challenge in Russia. We also see the expansion of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. NATO, going back to the Washington Treaty or the North Atlantic Treaty of 1949, was set up as a defensive union between 12 countries, including the United States, to try and uphold democratic values. 11 of the 12 countries in NATO at its founding were fully democratic with constitutional rights. Portugal was the exception, and it too later became much more democratic, and it remains so today. But from the Russian mindset, we see countries joining NATO. Forgive the map a little bit, but we have Greece and Turkey in 1952, Germany, especially West Germany, in 1955. But then when the Soviet Union falls and the Iron Curtain's gone, there are several countries that just try to run to the West. They want to get away from the Soviet Union. They want to get away from Russia. And so in the green, you can see them, Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary. And then in the lighter shade of green, you see a whole set of other countries, Hungary, Slovenia, Romania, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, all joining NATO. In the Western mind, they did it of their own volition. They're sovereign countries. It's what they wanted to do. They wanted protection. They wanted Uncle Sam to help them. From the Russian mind, it's, oh no, we are being surrounded. Our buffer zone is being lost. And so that's part of the misunderstanding right now between what we see happening. You can also see further expansions in 2017. Montenegro, a republic in the former Yugoslavia, becomes a member, and then another country, North Macedonia, in 2020 also joins NATO. And so, again, in the Western mindset, these are countries that want to get away from Russia, but from the Russian mindset, it's actually a Western plot to get closer to Russia. That's the way it's viewed by Putin in it. And so it's a worthy point of discussion. So what motivates Mr. Putin? It's hard to say concretely because not that many people know him and well. But what we can say is that two major facets of the Russian psyche are security and order. It's one of the reasons why I took you on a long historical journey, because there have been times of troubles. There have been times of real challenges in just preventing invasion and upholding Russian sovereignty. And so security and order remain at the forefront. We also have the Russian Empire that I think is probably being rebuilt. And so the danger of, if Ukraine loses in this, is that other countries are next, are probably in that line until this is rebuilt. I've made the case that Vladimir Putin is trying to be a Peter the Great figure. And I've also noted some of the big demographic issues in Russia. If the Russian population is shrinking every few decades by about 10 million, how long does it take until Russia is no longer a major player? But if they forcibly annex Ukraine, 45 million people, and Belarus, 10 million people, and follow a similar trajectory, that population slowdown all of a sudden stops. Another point in year 2 of the conflict is probably self-preservation. Putin knows he's made an error now. He knows he's committed a grievous faux pas. Western sanctions have been maybe slow, but still very, very significant. And it's hard to imagine an international forum in which Vladimir Putin is ever welcomed again. We're also in a situation where he's probably faced numerous assassination attempts within his country. And so he's very, very isolated. Self-preservation is another point. Stopping NATO, again, I make no excuses for what he's trying to do, but from his mindset, his view is that NATO is encroaching and continuing to move, and his goal is to stop all of that. My response to that is, what Eastern European country has ever expressed or showed or displayed any aggression towards you? It's almost always the other way around. There's been blatant Russian aggression against Estonia, especially in the cyber realm, as early as 2007. Election interference in numerous Eastern European countries. In August of 2008, Russia engaged in a brutal conflict against the little country of Georgia, effectively annexing territories in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. It was the first time in the history of warfare where all 5 domains of warfare were used. There was a land-based attack. There was a naval assault from the Black Sea. The Air Force was used. It was coordinated via the Russian GPS through space. And there was a massive cyber attack at the same time. All 5 domains of warfare utilized together here. But this was a major act of aggression against a small country that simply wanted to be democratic and to join NATO and the European Union. They never have, they've never made it that far, but there were warning signs about Putin's aggression a long time ago, about what he was capable of doing. We can also see in Chechnya, to go back to the 1990s, under Boris Yeltsin as president, a very brutal campaign of violence from 1994 to 1996, resulting effectively in Russian morale being very low and de facto Chechen autonomy. When Vladimir Putin rose to power as prime minister in 1999, one of his first actions was to revisit this. And what he did is he engaged in a campaign of carpet bombing of the capital city of Grozny. Everything that we're seeing in Ukraine right now happened here in 1999 and 2000. 2008 with Georgia. 2014 with Ukraine. I mentioned sending in non-insigniated military personnel, capturing Crimea, setting up a false referendum, and then illegally annexing it, and then taking territories in Donetsk and Luhansk. Putin all along claimed that Russian troops were not in Ukraine, trying to deny the fact. And it's one of the reasons why he sent in military personnel without insignia. The reason why we know Russian troops were actually there was through Instagram. Russian troops were posting to Instagram, and it was being geotagged that they were inside of Ukraine. Syria in 2015. The Syrian civil war started in 2011, but as the brutal dictator Bashar al-Assad was continuing to wage a campaign of violence against his own people, Vladimir Putin ends up being the reason why he's propped up. As al-Assad was losing, one of the reasons he's still in place in 2023 is that Russia came to his defense. Russian troops have been active on the ground. Russia has de facto taken an air base just outside of Latakia. Think about that strategically as a location, and a naval base in Tartus. That's a Navy base for the Russians on the Mediterranean. Russian naval bases are generally in cold water and will ice over for at least a portion of the year. And so, if we lead up to 2022 and think about the bloodthirsty nature of Vladimir Putin, there's a long history. In 1999 and 2000, in Chechnya, in 2008 in Georgia, in 2014 in Ukraine, in 2015 in Syria. What does year 2 of the conflict bring? It's a continuation of that violence, but chances are, unless he's stopped, we will see a repetition of this in some way, shape, or form. I'll leave it there. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my talk.
What's going to happen? What's the solution?
Great question. So Volodymyr Zelensky of the Ukrainian president has basically said, we are going to fight for the entirety of our territory, which probably means Crimea as well as Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk. And you can see it from his perspective. They've spilled so much blood. They've given so much treasure already. Nothing short of a victory where they get all of Ukraine back will be acceptable. And so there's part of me that really does believe that if the Ukrainians gain the momentum, it is possible to drive the Russians out of all of this area, Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, Donetsk, Luhansk. Crimea is the prickly one, though, because I think Zelensky wants it back, but again, to look at the Russian perspective on this and not to excuse its behavior, it's brutal and it's bloodthirsty and it's gone against international law. But Sevastopol is a very important naval base for the Russians. Think of the Black Fleet. And it's a weird story because it was part of Russia when the Soviet Union was founded in 1922. But under Nikita Khrushchev, that is the general secretary that took over from Joseph Stalin, it was actually given to Ukraine as a present in 1954. So that sounds awfully weird, right? Like, why did that happen? It was to celebrate 300 years of Ukraine being in the Russian Empire. So it was given as a present to the brothers in Ukraine. And so this was not an issue when it was all the Soviet Union, but when the Soviet Union dissolved and Crimea was in Ukraine and outside of Russia, Russians long felt this is an issue for our Navy because of Sevastopol's location into the Black Sea, into the Mediterranean, out into the Atlantic. From the Ukrainian perspective, though, they'd leased it to the Russians until 2042. So Ukraine has actually never made a move, has always allowed the Russians to have a position here, but nonetheless, Putin felt the need to act in 2014 and annex it. So my sense is that Russia will fight tooth and nail to defend Crimea, which makes an end to this very difficult. There is, however, pressure. China has recently put together a proposal to end the conflict. China is very powerful economically, maybe militarily, we don't know, but there's suggestions there. We have to give them, I think, due respect in that sense, but this is going to be the prickly one. The other issue is if Ukraine runs out of ammunition, effective equipment, it could lose significant portions of the territory, and at some point the war will come to an end just based on attrition. That is one way that wars end, and so we could see that even if there's kind of periodic fighting or shots fired across the new border, if it spans this area that Russia currently possesses. But my sense is that Ukrainians are not going to want to give this up. The reason being is that they want this to end now. They don't want their children and grandchildren to fight it, and they do not want Russia to just rebuild and come back in 10 years and then try again. So my sense is that all of this area will be Ukrainian or the war will continue. This is the particularly difficult one. What happens with it? The other potential outcomes are Putin turns 71 in October. As I mentioned, there have been numerous assassination attempts. But what if he has a heart attack? What if there's some kind of other issue? Will it lead to another time of the Troubles? It's not impossible where this war ends by Russia being divided. That is not out of the question if Ukraine has a military success and or there's something that happens to Russia, to Vladimir Putin. The other outcome, unfortunately, is that brutal dictators are not usually replaced by Jeffersonian democratic leaders. They're typically replaced by someone as bad or worse. So expect an ultranationalist to rise to power in Russia. Expect Vladimir Putin to probably hand off the reins to someone fairly young who has even greater ambitions for a Russian empire. So I know I've said a lot with all of that. There are still, in my mind, all kinds of outcomes. I do not expect the fighting to stop anytime soon. I pray it does, but I think the Ukrainians have every right to try and take their territory back. And then we in the United States have to decide to what degree are we going to continue supporting them. And we've given a lot of support thus far. Absolutely. Please, yes, sir.
From a layman's standpoint, I've always thought that Russia is bigger and stronger, and they could crush Ukraine at any time. Is that true?
That was the typical thinking for many of us going into it, from the layperson to those in intelligence to those in the military. It was assumed that Russia would roll over Ukraine in 72 hours or be something very quick. It was why Zelensky was offered a ride out of the country. He said, "I need ammunition, I don't need a ride." And he stayed. And I think it took a lot of people by surprise as to just the extent of the corruption in Russia. When we think about the military chain of command in the United States, simply to have working vehicles or C-17s flying over us regularly, it takes a lot of integrity. It takes a lot of people working together. But in Russia's dictatorial system, where there's a lot of grift and people taking from the top, basic things like the maintenance of trucks were not done, inflating tires. And so Russia has proven to be very, very inept in a way that shouldn't have surprised me, because in the 1904-1905 Russo-Japanese War, the Russians were just very bad at taking territory. In the Winter War against Finland, the same thing was true. Russia has a long history of bungling invasions. It's very, very good at defending, and it's very good at limited war, where it can go into a place like Syria and just provide mercenaries and just support for Bashar al-Assad against the opposition forces, mainly in this area. A lot of the Kurdish forces in here. ISIS had a lot of this area, and the government under Assad had a lot of this area. But really, Russia has only been successful in these very limited wars. In something larger, it has really just bungled it. And the danger, though, is Russia has a big population and can theoretically send a lot of people. That's always been their answer. Please. Yeah.
My other question is, are the sanctions working, or is that just window dressing?
It's a great question. In my view, they were slow in being rolled out. I wrote an op-ed in the Columbus Dispatch in the lead up to the war, noting that this war is probably coming. A lot of people argued it wasn't. No one's going to invade. It's not something that's going to happen, but that sanctions needed to be in place earlier. Having said that, many of the sanctions have been very good. They've taken their time. They've been slow. Some of them have been kind of, why is this happening now? But the sanctions overall have been good. The problem, however, is twofold. One is that only Western countries and East Asian democracies and Australasian democracies have put them in place, meaning there's a lot of countries in the world that have no sanctions. In fact, some of our best allies, like India, have actually bought a lot of Russian oil and natural gas. And so they have funded Russia's war campaign despite being a pretty good ally of the United States. And so Western sanctions have been very good, but they have found ways around it. China, India, Indonesia have bought massive amounts of Russian oil, such that their economy only contracted a little bit last year rather than 10 or 20 or 30% as should have happened under the sanctions. The other big issue is that there are holes in the sanctions. Western goods, that is, automobiles made in Michigan and Ohio, are getting into Russia via Turkey and Georgia. And so even though Western sanctions are in place, if a buyer comes from a third country, buys something from GM, let's say, it can still get into Russia and around sanctions if it goes through Turkey and Georgia into Russia in that way. There's a massive line of trucks that you can see via space just waiting even now to get into Russia around those sanctions. And so in my mind, the sanctions are appropriate. They've been good, albeit a bit slow, but there are loopholes that we have failed to close. A bigger diplomatic effort is needed to get at other countries to say, look, it could be you next if you don't help in this effort, and to figure out ways to really have the sanctions bite, because Western goods, very high-level products, are still getting to Russia. Thank you. Please.
Could you talk a little bit about what would happen if Ukraine became a part of NATO?
NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So this conversation goes back to around 2004, 2005. when President George W. Bush of the United States said, we really need to be looking at ways to protect democratic partners elsewhere. And he mentioned by name Georgia and Ukraine that had recently gone through the Rose Revolution of 2003 and the Orange Revolution of 2004. The cliff notes on that is that these were revolutions to overturn fraudulent elections and to better constitute democratic outcomes without fraud in them. And so it was part of a discussion, but the only way you can get into NATO is to have all of the member states with unanimity support it. And so because it was viewed by many as provoking Russia, it never made it to a vote. It never got to that position of allowing them into NATO. And that conversation has continued from roughly 2004, 2005 to the present. The big issue with NATO is that there are 14 articles under the founding document. So the North Atlantic Treaty, the Washington Treaty. But the most important one, and many of you have probably heard of it, is Article 5. Article 5 is an attack on one is akin to an attack on all countries, meaning that if you attack one of us, all the other 29 countries come to the defense. And it's a wonderful system. It's actually a big reason why there are so few interstate wars in my mind, because you don't want to mess with NATO. That's just an issue. And so if Ukraine joined and Russia invaded, all of NATO would be in a war against Ukraine, and theoretically World War III, which is why Ukraine was never allowed into NATO. Having said that, now that Ukraine has so valiantly defended its territory for the last year, many countries have said you should join the European Union first. And in the scope of history, that's kind of backwards. Normally countries join NATO and then the European Union. They kind of show we are democratizing, we're improving the rule of law, our judicial system works. We have the ability to join the European Union now. But interestingly, Ursula von der Leyen, who is the European Union's Commission President, effectively the President of the European Union, has said Ukraine and Georgia really should join the European Union because there's a solidarity among us, because you're fighting for the values that we hold. You're willing to bleed and die for it. And so that's something that's possible, but under the Copenhagen criteria, there are 35 chapters that have to be fulfilled for a country to join the European Union. That would be pretty hard to do for Ukraine right now, but there's so much solidarity that it is possible.
What do you think is the possibility of an assassination? Russia has quite a black eye.
Absolutely.
And a lot of young people have to wonder, are they really supportive? They're losing a lot of their young people. To me, it just makes sense that someone's going to take it.
It's a double-edged sword because absolutely you have to wonder just how many grieving mothers and families are out there if the report is true. If there are 300,000 dead Russian troops, there's a lot of aggression, a lot of anger towards Putin. There's been a history of assassination attempts, but he's also very isolated. He has a lot of bodyguards in place, and really since 2004, 2008, that type of time window, the Russian media went from being very free to not free. And it has heavily eroded so that it's very difficult for any dissent to hit Russian television, radio. I was interviewed by Sputnik, a Russian news station once. I mean, their whole goal is to stir up dissension in the West. I brought 5 independent Russian journalists to the Cedarville University campus in 2019. They were still one of the few that were free. They have been shut down now. And so the double-edged sword part of it is it's become like an echo chamber where if you don't support Putin, you get in trouble and identified. And if you're identified, you're unlikely to be able to take part in something to take him down. I mentioned some terrible scenarios with the future of Russia, but I want to also leave a relatively positive one. There is a dissident opposition leader by the name of Alexei Navalny who has long kind of stood for Russian constitutional values. We've got to be careful of putting any one person on a pedestal because he has his flaws and every leader has challenges. But at the same time, if he were to replace Putin, it's the one way that I see Russia getting back into the good graces of the rest of the world, into the G20, things like that. As I mentioned, Putin has his vulnerabilities, but he's also very isolated. He's very good at self-preservation. So I don't see it ending immediately, but who knows? There are a lot of people with anger. Yes, sir, please.
Do you see us giving them the F-16s that they've asked for? And if we do, what's the likelihood of Putin going nuclear?
It's probably a question that's coming in the next few months, and it's hard to say for sure because Western allies of Ukraine have been very reluctant to give more and greater weaponry, although we're now seeing in Ukraine the M1 Abrams tank, we're seeing British Challenger 2 tanks, German-made Leopard 2 tanks getting into Ukraine, and so it is a change. Ukraine has also asked both Israel and the United States for anti-missile defense. It looks like the United States is in the midst of training Ukrainians to be able to use it. The danger there is, and one of the reasons why Israel has been so reluctant to share the Iron Dome system is that if it falls into Russian hands, it gets reverse engineered, and all of that technology, the research and development's lost. The F-16 has long been part of this discussion because it would help to protect Ukrainian skies. It would give the Ukrainians an offensive ability beyond drones. As a quick tangent, Ukrainians have been amazing with the drone technology. We in the United States have learned a ton in terms of how to coordinate the space, the cyberspace with drones. My sense is that most governments are going to be reluctant to give F-16s. They're expensive, and it could cause Putin to calculate differently and with the potential of a nuclear weapon. At the same time, at some point, I see some government giving aircraft to Ukraine, and maybe the United States, others with F-16s will follow, but that's a conversation, I think, where the can will be kicked down the road 6, 9, 12 months from now. So we'll have to see.
The question to you is, what are your thoughts on controlling nuclear power, and especially going into Ukraine?
Thank you for your service. I imagine that was probably a very scary time. Yeah, I imagine so. My parents and I, we were talking about a family friend who fled Hungary following 1956 and ended up living in Michigan, and he survived the Holocaust and then the Soviet repression of Hungary in 1956. So it's really quite a remarkable life because he became a doctor in the United States and saved and helped many, many people. So back then, there were 2 nuclear powers that has expanded to 9 today that have nuclear weaponry. Thankfully, there are a lot of very good international treaties like the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty that even though we have not signed in the United States, it's led to a lot less nuclear tests. It's been much better for the environment, things of that nature. If you go back to previous decades, think about all the fallout from nuclear testing from all of those countries. Russia last week withdrew from the New START treaty, that is the New Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. Many of you will remember the SALT and START talks of the 1970s, 1980s, culminating between President Reagan and Secretary General Gorbachev in the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty that limited kind of missiles, their length, and things of that nature. But more importantly, it really helped the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union. The New START Treaty was signed between President Obama of the United States and Medvedev of Russia. He was in for 4 years, although Putin was always in charge during that time. And the New START Treaty was in place for 10 years and reduced the number of deployed nuclear weapons to 1,550. Which is quite remarkable because if we go back to the late 1980s, there were some 70,000 nuclear weapons between the US and the Soviet Union alone. And so we have really reduced the number of nuclear weapons and put in place decent treaties for that. The problem with New START is that Russia probably always cheated on it. President Trump was going to withdraw from it because he wanted China as part of it. He thought that if only the US and Russia do it, then we're kind of tying our hands behind our back if China just continues to develop its nuclear program. President Biden re-signed it in 2021, I think on the idea that it at least has a cage to the number of nuclear weapons, even if it does have the challenge of not preventing Russian cheating or China's growing ambitions. But now that Putin has threatened withdrawal from it, there is a danger. The good news is there's only one country that's been testing nuclear weapons, Kim Jong-un of North Korea. I don't know if that is good news, but it's to say at least 9 countries aren't testing, and it has long been feared that this will escalate and grow. A tangential point is that when the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, again, 40,000 nuclear weapons, there were nuclear weapons in Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. And Ukraine was actually the 3rd largest holder of nuclear weapons in 1991. They gave up their nuclear weapons in the Budapest Memorandum, named after the capital city of Hungary, in 1994. It's a memorandum, it's not a treaty that binds us. It's a memorandum. But the tragic part of this is they had the 3rd largest set of nuclear weapons on the planet. They gave them up. We, the United States, signed it. The United Nations signed it. The United Kingdom signed it. And a gentleman by the name of Sergei Lavrov signed it for Russia. Sergei Lavrov at that time was Russia's ambassador to the United Nations. He today is their foreign minister and basically the person that launched the propaganda campaign to invade Ukraine, despite his signature being on this saying, if you give up nuclear weapons, we're not going to invade you. So that is one of the reasons why so many Americans have said, we need to help Ukraine, we need to do a lot to Ukraine. It's why the British and many other NATO allies have done it. But the nuclear question that you raise is one of the most serious. And it's, if something is launched, it's just hard to say how and where it ends. And that is one of the very, very scary components of it. Thank you.
We know that President Biden has been quite supportive, very supportive, but in 5 months, the first debate among Republican candidates for the presidency will take place. And it looks
Yes.
like it might become an issue
Yes.
among them how much to be supportive or refrain from supportive. How is that going to impact the whole scene?
It could have a major impact. In general, through the first year of the war, Americans, roughly to the tune of about 70%, supported Ukraine. There were both wings of the Democratic and Republican parties that opposed ongoing support, sometimes for very strange reasons. But it was also a fair question to always ask, how are taxpayer monies being used? It's the right of every American to follow that and to rightly raise that question. In Republican circles, I think there's a genuine fear of escalation of this going further. It's where the F-16 question comes in. But it's a really big split right now because you have some of the central Republican leaders remaining lockstep in support for Ukraine, visiting Ukraine, but there are some others that are raising the question, and Republican support has become very, very split, almost 50-50 on the question of Ukraine. And so we shall see where it goes. It's going to be interesting to see where the major candidates fall on the debate stage. I think many recognize the dangers of Vladimir Putin and rebuilding a Russian empire and kicking the can down the road, because if there's a bigger Russia that's more aggressive, and Turkey's aggressive, and Iran's aggressive, and China's aggressive, it's a very dangerous world. But there are impulses in the United States to be a little more isolationist, a little more careful. That's always been part of the United States. And so it's a question of foreign policy. Foreign policy is an area where we all need to be very humble, because it's very difficult to predict. A lot of people get it wrong. But the debates are going to be interesting. I think there are going to be some clear lines that are drawn as well. So thank you. So the reference point is to Finland in the 1960s, a base here that the Russians kind of shared with the Finns, and the utilization of Russian ships into the area. Under NATO, Sweden and Finland, well, I guess I'll back up and say, Sweden and Finland have both held very neutral foreign policy stances since the Napoleonic Wars. So for the last 200 years, there are exceptions. They were involved in small ways in World Wars I and II, but generally the idea was to keep neutral. And when Finland gained its independence in 1917, it tried to keep this position, especially during the Cold War, of keeping the Soviets happy. It was known as the foreign policy of Finlandization, to not belong to one camp or another. And so one of the mechanisms was to allow the Soviets to dock, to utilize the space. I don't know whether it would count as a formal base or a formal point of connection, but certainly with the aggression in Ukraine, Finland doesn't want any point from which Russia. The question, the reference point is to a territory called Karelia, which sits right between the Russian and Finnish areas. There is an ethnic republic in Russia called Karelia that is still fairly heavily Finnish as well, but that was a significant portion of the fighting of the Winter War and remains a point of dispute between the two. But thanks for sharing. Yes, there are certain real dangers with Kim Jong-un. You can see some of the motivations of self-preservation with Putin and Kim Jong-un being similar. But to go back to this map, there is an 8-mile border with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea, in here. And the question was, what role has the DPRK played in this conflict? One of the strange points is that North Korean ammunition has been sent to Russia. So to go back to your question, sir, about sanctions and the role of outside players, China, India, Indonesia have bought massive amounts of oil. Iran has supplied drones in particular and other weaponry, but North Korea has supplied a lot of ammunition. So it is a weird one. If you need to get ammunition from North Korea, what does it say about your country, its fighting forces, and how they're doing? To go to the nuclear question that was also raised, it was just, how does he play into it? North Korea is the only country that has tested a nuclear weapon in the 21st century. They've conducted 6 nuclear tests and numerous, even this year, or dozens this year, of missile tests, some of which have flown directly over Japan, which is very scary from the Japanese perspective as a very good ally of the United States. But my sense is that something internal is happening in North Korea. It's probably not as bad as the mid-1990s. In 1994, 1995, an estimated 2 million North Koreans died of famine. That's out of a population of 25 million. And so my sense is that something is happening internally to dissident populations in North Korea. One of the reasons why he and his father tended to act out was to try and get concessions from the West or sanctions relief, things of that nature. But I'm also wondering if we will see another North Korean nuclear test in the next year, 2 years, something like that. And that could certainly play into all of this. The good news is it's a long way away from the kind of scene of the fighting, but North Korea has already involved itself in a way, and we'll see if they do more. So, thanks.
You could easily get nuclear weapons from North Korea, or do you think they have enough that they wouldn't need to?
They have the world's largest stock. Russia has the world's largest stockpile of nuclear weapons. Now, if we go back to the question on corruption and whether they're still good, that's hard to say. But my sense is there's going to be a decent nuclear stockpile still in Russia, unlikely to get it from North Korea. But every now and then there are weird things that happen in international relations to cause plausible deniability. You know, Russia could say, hey, it's not our nuclear weapon. We don't know where it came from. So there are scenarios like that that could play in. For those listening, the question is Russia's connection with China, how Congress will deal with that, and then whether China will go after Taiwan. Taiwan, in the mindset of the Chinese Communist Party, is a renegade 23rd province that freed itself but must one day be brought back into the fold. From the mindset of most Taiwanese and most other people, and myself included, it's a sovereign territory that has every right to defend itself, build its own democratic and capitalist society. And to get to the question of Chinese military aggression, on the one hand, Xi Jinping, the Secretary General of the Chinese Communist Party, is serving a third term that just started. And these terms last for 5 years. It's not in any way democratic. It's a full dictatorship. I should be clear. And it also breaks the generational contract of recent Chinese leaders. So if you think of Jiang Zemin or Hu Jintao, they were in for a decade, and the idea is that the next generation of leader will then come to the fore. Xi Jinping hasn't done that. And he's promised within his term privately that Taiwan, one way or another, will be brought back into China. So that, to me, is very, very dangerous because it suggests military action or some kind of subversion of Taiwan. On the other side of it, Xi Jinping has to have looked at Ukraine, seen the Western countries coalesce around Ukraine and support it, and probably it's caused him to think twice. The other issue is that Taiwan, I like to describe it as trying to pick up a porcupine. Like at some point you're going to get stuck. At some point they have been practicing and militarizing and watching Ukraine and knowing that it could be them. And so they are well armed, they're well prepared, they have a lot that's in place. It's going to be very, very difficult even for a much bigger China. So it's a challenge to know what's going to happen because on the one hand, there's a big push in China for Taiwan to be taken. On the other hand, it just will be very difficult for them. The other part of the question relates to Congress, and it's hard to know because at what point are we willing to risk a World War III over this? That is the central question. How much money are we willing to spend to uphold Ukraine and Taiwan? And I think for many Republicans, even some that have become have asked more questions, there's still a great concern over what the world will look like if Ukraine and Taiwan were to be lost to Russia and China respectively. And typically, sorry, please.
In the case of Taiwan, there's no treaty in effect.
No.
There's no reason for us to get involved, really, is there?
No, although most U.S. presidents have said they will uphold Taiwanese sovereignty. But yes, you're absolutely right. There's no.
Ukraine,
Uh-huh.
you can see resistance building.
Absolutely. It's hard to know until it happens. Thank you all for having me. Really appreciate your time. Thank you.